Our tale of this film, Dredd, begins with the man referred to as the godfather of British comics, Pat Mills. Mills was a freelance writer, typically of girl comics like Tammy, Pink, and Sandy, before being hired by IPC magazines to create a new war comic for them, Battle Picture Weekly, in 1975. Battle was notable for telling grittier and more realistic war stories, and was such a success that he was tasked with creating a second comic, Action, in 1976. Action was popular but controversial. But what's particularly relevant is that while working on Action, Mills frequently collaborated with a writer named John Wagner. Underline that name in your brain as we go on. Well, in late 1975, Kelvin Gosnell, who was a young sub-editor at IPC at the time, noted the increasing number of sci-fi films in production. So he sent a memo suggesting that a science fiction anthology comic should be made. Even if it planned to run only as long as the boom lasts, he said. Although, given the right mix, I'm certain that it would stand a good chance of surviving much longer than the movie boom. IPC's editorial director John Sanders liked the idea, though he named the book 2000 AD on the grounds he expected the book to be dead and buried by then. By this time, Mills had earned himself a solid reputation as an editor who was both innovative and knew what readers wanted, how to give them stories that really resonated with them. It was no surprise Sanders turned to him, and Mills' plan was to repeat his strategy for success on Battle in Action, tell stories that would be edgy and appeal to both adults and younger readers. For 2000 AD, Mills wanted to have a cop character that drew upon the 70s cinematic cop anti-hero Dirty Harry, but also with strains of British characters such as Michael Caine's action roles. Mills had been working on a horror idea, described as Doctor Who of the occult, named Judge Dredd with an A, after a British reggae musician. This Judge Dredd didn't work out, but Mills liked the name, so he asked if he could reuse it. Gosnell suggested if he did, it should be changed to Dredd with a double D. When Mills thought about the character of Judge Dredd, what came to mind was something that John Wagner did for another IPC magazine, Valiant, with One-Eyed Jack. Jack Napier was a really tough, eye-patch-wearing cop in crime-plagued New York City, and his series of stories in Valiant was controversial. On Action, Wagner also had a character named Dredger, a tough undercover cop. While he was very versatile, he and Mills worked together on many girl comics, it showed that he had a really solid grasp of what would make a great cop for 2000 AD. The concept was refined by giving this future cop a context, an enormous urban sprawl on the east coast of North America called Mega City 1, overpopulated and riddled with crime. Drawing on concepts like Mad Max, Death Race 2000, and the Wild West Circuit judges with their broad latitude in the face of chaotic lawlessness, Dredd was made more than just a cop, but the literal judge, jury, and executioner in Mega City 1. For the look, Mills turned to Carlos Izquierda, who had done some work on Battle, suggesting he might look something like David Carradine in a promotional image from Death Race 2000. Izquierda designed the character, and when it was passed on to Wagner, his response was passionate, but not in a good way. "Fucking hell," he is quoted as having said, "he looks like a fucking Spanish pirate. I'm not writing him. He looks fucking stupid." In time, he walked that assessment back. Most notable about his appearance was the helmet that left only the character's mouth and chin exposed. The first Judge Dredd story didn't work for Mills, so Wagner came up with an alternate while collaborating with Mills, Bank Raid. Izquierda did the art, and Mills knew the city shown in that work was exactly what they needed. He moved the setting to the year 2099 to reflect the art, but despite that, Bank Raid didn't have quite the right tone and was put on hold. Unrelated to this, Wagner left 2000 AD, something related to an IP rights dispute, forcing Mills to find a bunch of writers and artists to get Judge Dredd off the ground. He didn't make it in time for the first issue in February 1977, and the second was a patchwork of Peter Harris, rewritten by Mills, and with a conclusion suggested by Gosnell. Judge Whitey was drawn by Mike McMahon, a recent art school graduate, though an image of Dredd himself was taken from Esquerra's bank raid work and pasted into the first page of the story. Over the first 8 Dredd episodes, 5 writers and 4 artists were involved, and most notably, in the story Anti-Car Heist, Dredd removed his helmet. But the artwork was so unimpressive that the face was covered with a censored caption. This helped to birth the rule that Dredd's face was to never actually be seen by the reader. Esquerra left the book, citing his dissatisfaction with the other artists, though Mills says it was for the chance to tell stories with his original character over in battle. Wagner returned immediately following Anti-Car Heist with Robot Wars, working to fully flesh out Judge Dredd. The character was written as a highly dedicated, tough, humorless lawman. However, Mills was anti-authoritarian, and Wagner liked to blend his action stories with social commentary. So while Judge Dredd was a story about this tough lawman, there was also a great deal of subtext to the work. As Darren Wolk has noted, Judge Dredd is a rare story in which the protagonist is both the hero and the villain, a righter of wrongs, but also a symbol of the oppression of the system. The story is set in a satirized United States, with Mount Rushmore moved to just outside the city and now includes Jimmy Carter, a hick town named Deliverance, and some incident that means that 4 episodes apparently cannot be reprinted. I don't know what, but it seems to involve something related to a follow-up story where Judge Dredd had to clear the name of the Jolly Green Giant, which admittedly only makes one more curious to know what happened. The main setting, however, is a New York City that's sprawling out of control. In that city, the Statue of Liberty stands in the shadow of the Statue of Judgment. In one particular page, Dredd stands before the 2 statues as the caption reads, "Justice has a price. The price is freedom." Even in Robot Wars, featuring an uprising among mechanical beings of the city, the droids chant, "Call me Kenneth says it's right for slaves to kill their masters." A character in its own right is the setting Esquerra created back in Bank Raid, which included the huge towers and elevated roadways. When the first episode appeared, it was set in New York, but after that it was clarified that New York was just one subset of Mega City 1. Originally with a numeral 1, but then the 1 was spelled out. Mike McMahon and Ian Gibson both helped expand upon that, helping to establish what Mega City 1 was. The tower blocks, each housing 60,000 people, were often given weird names, such as naming one after Charlton Heston and another after a Clint Eastwood character. Mini-cities within Mega City, tower blocks were even known to come into conflict with other tower blocks. Mega City 1 had early on been shown in an illustration by Esquerra to stretch from Montreal to Georgia, but it expanded even further until it was realized to have been made too large. A problem solved thanks to the Apocalypse War, which helpfully destroyed enough to make it more manageable for the creators. 2000 AD, like many British comics, was a weekly, not a monthly, hence why they had multiple stories being told each week. So it was 3 years later, in issue number 149, that a recurring adversary appeared, Judge Death. An undead being in a lifeless world, he crosses dimensions to Mega City 1, where he begins murdering on the grounds that because crimes are committed by the living are criminals and must receive capital punishment. Issue number 150 gave Judge Dredd an ally, though, for handling these kinds of threats. Judge Cassandra Anderson. Her mental abilities are a powerful tool in dealing with the psychic and supernatural phenomenon in crimes that sometimes crop up. Anderson is instrumental in foiling Judge Death, but the storyline combined with Brian Bolland's exceptional designs for the characters and incredible illustrations solidified both as significant parts of the Judge Dredd canon. Judge Death would not only return, but with the Dark Judges as a recurring menace for Mega City 1. Anderson was likewise beloved by readers. She complimented Dredd by zigging where he zagged. Female with mental power instead of male with physical power. Irreverent versus stoic. Questioning authority versus absolute adherence to the law. No helmet versus the faceless. Anderson gave the book opportunities to stretch in ways that couldn't be done with Dredd alone without damaging his character anyway. She was a popular choice for spin-off and standalone stories. Judge Dredd was a huge hit in Britain, and it became a breeding ground for talent. Besides those we mentioned, over the next 15 years saw stories by Alan Grant, Garth Ennis, Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, Mark Millar. Even Neil Gaiman wrote a Dredd story called Secrets of the Black Museum. Dave Gibbons, artist on Watchmen, wrote and drew several Dredd stories in the early days of the character. Judge Dredd was such a hit that he crossed over with American comic properties like Batman, Predator, and Alien. He expanded beyond comics to other media like games, both tabletop and video. But all the while, Judge Dredd was destined for the big screen and a feature film. In 1978, Superman lived up to its promise, "You will believe a man can fly." But comic book-based properties didn't. Flash Gordon, while becoming a cult classic, was a failure at the time, and it wasn't alone. The 80s saw the Robin Williams flop Popeye and the infamous Lucas-related Howard the Duck. Heavy Metal and Swamp Thing did better with critics, but proved more the exception, and the dearth of comic book properties of that decade was usually broken only by a film failing to measure up. It wasn't until the end of the 80s, when Tim Burton's Batman was a breakout success, that studios started tackling comics properties. What's even more surprising is that they were foregoing traditional superheroes to go with other kinds of stories and characters. Now, this is unsurprising in retrospect, as DC's intellectual property was at the beck and call of Warner Brothers as part of the Time Warner family. And thanks to years of horrible rights management at Marvel Comics, their worthwhile properties were all tied up in deals with unmentionably bad production companies, of which Dolph Lundgren's Punisher was the rare one that even got made. But the success of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the year after Batman showed live-action comic adaptations were potential hits. Thus, the 90s saw the boom of films based upon properties independent of the big two. Dick Tracy, The Mask, The Crow, Tank Girl, Barbed Wire, Spawn, and, arguably, Men in Black, a comic absorbed by Malibu that in turn was absorbed by Marvel. Given this trend, you would be forgiven for thinking that Judge Dredd was just one of many independent properties that were being gobbled up at this time. But in actuality, his journey to the silver screen was far longer than you could have imagined. Charles Lippincott, who among other things was the mastermind behind marketing Star Wars, was a fan of Judge Dredd since almost the very beginning, in 1978. Over a period of 5 years off and on, he worked to try to get the film rights, including an entire year of having George Lucas's British law team negotiate every detail. In 1985, they began working on bringing in writers, one of whom was very interested, Edward Neumeier, who actually wanted to get the rights himself, but just couldn't. In the end, Neumeier wasn't involved, though considering what he was working on, you might see where his Judge Dredd ideas went, at least in part, into his script for RoboCop. Edward R. Pressman, who was a producer on other films we've looked at, like Conan the Barbarian and The Phantom of the Paradise, plus the hit Wall Street and many others, was approached by Lippincott in 1986. Pressman compared it to Conan, in that this was clearly more than just a character. It was someone in a distinct world, and said he had no doubts about Dredd's potential. He and Lippincott partnered on the film, excited at the possibilities, until the next year when they saw RoboCop. Pressman was depressed that they had been beaten to the punch, and now they had to instruct anyone coming on board to swing far away from where RoboCop had gone. The script was Frankenstein together from writers including Jan Strand and writing team Tim Hunter and James Crumley. The script was praised, a down-and-dirty tale of the mutants of the cursed earth, with Anderson and Judge Death featuring in it all. But things fell apart. They'd been assuming a $20 million film while the script was being written, then heard it was supposed to be an $8 million film, and the budget estimate for the script actually made was $60 million. Judged, no pun intended, to be unfeasible, Judge Dredd was shelved until comic writer-artist Howard Chaykin came in and sold them on a brilliant take with hints of inspiration by the Lone Ranger. But then the treatment came back and it was completely different and awful. Again, Judge Dredd went back on the shelf until Mark LaFaya came along. A big fan of the source material, he went for a take that was over the top. Pressman loved it and was ready to sign him on the spot, but cooler heads told him to hold off. There were hints that Sylvester Stallone could come aboard, but if they did that, it needed to be a harder action film than this. LaFaya was off the project. Further obstacles arose over a fundamental disagreement between Lippincott and Pressman. Pressman felt the film had to have Judge Death. The character was so powerful and iconic, had such potential. But Lippincott thought it'd be a mistake. Judge Death is incredible on the page, but can you, with early 90s technology, make him convincing in a film? He didn't think so. Peter Briggs, a screenwriter who also had experience in cinematography, disagreed. Even then, he felt a combination of puppetry, a human actor, some CGI, it could have been done. But Lippincott was pushing for adapting the Rico story, which had to do with Judge Dredd's background, believing they needed to sell audiences on Dredd's character this way to support future films. If they had a hit, they could do Judge Death next time. So the decision was made to have the two ideas tested. Briggs would write the Judge Death script, and the Rico script would go to William Wisher, who worked with James Cameron on Terminator 2. However, the feedback was driving Briggs up the wall, and finally, for the sake of his own sanity, he abandoned the project. Wisher's script was what they'd been looking for, bringing the Rico story into focus and putting Dredd on a character journey from fully indoctrinated to the state to a less absolutist position. Satisfied with this, Pressman then brought in Andrew G. Vania to executive produce. His company, Synergy Pictures, would take the ball and run with it from there. It was Vania who was impressed with a film called The Young Americans, the debut film of young director Danny Cannon. The film's title might be misleading. Cannon's actually British. The Young Americans being referred to are actually part of a criminal gang of English youth who are emulating American culture. And like many young Brits, Cannon had loved Judge Dredd growing up. In fact, when he heard in 1987 about plans to make a film, he created a poster that was published, where in his gleeful imagination, Harrison Ford played Judge Dredd, Christopher Walken the villain, Daryl Hannah played Anderson, special effects by the legendary Douglas Trumbull, and directed not by himself, but Ridley Scott. Vania was actually putting together a team for the film Die Hard with a Vengeance. In fact, this was the same time that, watching Pulp Fiction at Cannes to support Bruce Willis, that he saw Samuel L. Jackson as Jules, a part that Lawrence Fishburne was talked out of taking by his agent. Since negotiations with Fishburne were breaking down for Die Hard with a Vengeance, Vania offered the role to Jackson again. He offered Danny Cannon, on the strength of The American Youth, a chance to direct Die Hard with a Vengeance. Yet before even finishing the script, Cannon asked if he could pitch instead for Judge Dredd. He said the biggest mistake they could make with a sci-fi cop movie is to make it a cop movie with sci-fi. His passion and vision convinced Vania to give him the Judge Dredd's director chair instead. Steve D'Souza, whom we discussed with Demolition Man as working on Stallone's unmade Isobar film, rewrote Wisher's script, though it's been asserted that Cannon himself, along with Gary Goldman, did an uncredited rewrite. Despite what one might expect of a Hollywood action star like Stallone coming in to play a British character in a film being shot in Britain, He actually took it all very seriously. Danny Cannon said the only one who did more research for the film than himself was Stallone. According to Cannon, Stallone really got that even though Judge Dredd is American, the character himself was a British icon, that he wanted to embrace the totality of it. Stallone also publicly praised the crew, saying everyone, down to the people who were painting the sets, were probably the finest masters of their craft that he'd ever seen. But what's perhaps most surprising, given one of the universal criticisms of the film, is that it was not Stallone's insistence that he take off the helmet in the film. In fact, that was actually done against his own preference. Stallone wanted to keep the helmet on the whole time. And not just for the look, but for the practical fact that if he wore a helmet, it meant they wouldn't have to put makeup on his entire face for every scene. He wasn't a fan of makeup, see, and he actually liked the idea of not having to do it. But the producers felt if you got a big-name action star, especially at that price, you were getting him for his face as much as his name. Cannon wanted a dark tone to reflect the comic source, but the film he turned in came back with an NC-17 rating for its violence. This continued as they kept revising and resubmitting it. What's more, Stallone wasn't happy with it. He wanted to see the film edited into an action comedy, and in fact sat in on the editing to make that happen. The problem was, the film hadn't been made to be an action comedy, so it struggled to maximize the humorous moments that were there. Despite Stallone's hopes that they could get it down to a PG-13, they had to settle for finally qualifying as an R. The result, after a decade of determined struggle, is what some consider to be Stallone's worst film. Universally, it's agreed to have tremendous production value, but that the film is all surface with nothing underneath. Wagner was thoroughly disappointed that the character on the screen bore nothing in common with his Judge Dredd save the name. This film, along with Barbed Wire and Tank Girl, became an object lesson in comic book films of its time. Judge Dredd had been brought to the attention of a wider audience, but it was now associated with Sylvester Stallone's laugh-inducing rendition of I Am the Law. The Stallone film thus cast a long shadow. What can be worse for a property trying to find a new audience than having their only exposure be a punchline? So it should surprise no one that Dredd rising from the ashes wouldn't be on this side of the Atlantic, but back home in Britain. A year after the Judge Dredd film failed to make its case, DNA Films released Trainspotting, kicking off decade after decade of acclaimed works. At the moment, their adaptation of Shogun is still being talked about. DNA was co-founded by Andrew MacDonald, who was the one who thought the novel could be adapted successfully into Trainspotting. At the same time, a novel called The Beach by Alex Garland was published. After the success of Trainspotting, though, the studio floundered with subpar works, and it seemed for a while like they had peaked out of the gate. The one bona fide hit that MacDonald had during this time wasn't actually a DNA project. It was an adaptation of The Beach. With that success, Garland and MacDonald met to collaborate on the film that would turn things around for DNA, a horror story called 28 Days Later. It was lightning in a bottle, and the studio began turning in successes, including the next collaboration between the two, Sunshine. It was at this time, with DNA's reputation as an asset, that MacDonald, along with Alan Reich, who had executive produced the critically acclaimed The Last King of Scotland, they decided to pursue the rights to Judge Dredd. They were able to secure it, though the contract included one stipulation in response to the Stallone film. Judge Dredd was to never, ever take off his helmet. Naturally, MacDonald and Reich turned to Garland to discuss what they should make as a film. One thing they recognized was that they would never get the $90 million that Judge Dredd had, even not adjusting for inflation. If a property produces a flop, there's not usually optimism about a second attempt to adapt it. That meant the thing everyone had praised about that film, the world of Judge Dredd, they'd be unlikely to be able to match it. The fantastical flying cars and robots, that wasn't going to be an option. Therefore, the script had to put it all on Dredd. He'd have to carry the load, and that meant getting him right That was absolutely essential. If they could get Dredd himself to work, they'd be halfway there. To try to do that, they reached out to the foremost expert on Judge Dredd, Wagner himself. Wagner had not been silent on his disappointment over the Stallone film, saying it wasn't Dredd, especially giving him the arc. Dredd is not unchanging, but Garland compared the character's evolution to that of a glacier. Movement, but on a longer scale. Even the idea of him going from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law when it came to Anderson, as presented in the final film, was a bit fast for Dredd. But Wagner himself felt it was still believable. He served as a script consultant, although Garland asserted that he did in fact rewrite several pieces. They came down to speak to him in person, in fact. Wagner showed his objections to messing with Dredd were not in any way related to excessive ego. When asked how they would know him when they met him at the train station, he said, "Look for whoever looks like a bent cop. That'd be him." The obstacle, as Wagner noted, was that they were fighting the first film with their new version. It had to displace who and what Dredd had been with what he actually was. Combined with a limited budget, it was a definite challenge to try to overcome. Having the right story was also going to be vital. Garland experimented first with a judge death story, and then with an origin story. He tossed away both. They weren't a waste of time, but they were an object lesson in what not to do, which was to drop too much on the audience. This needed to ease you into Dredd and his world. You needed to learn who he was by his actions, and not by history or exposition. For that reason, Garland decided ultimately to tell a completely original tale, so he could tailor the story for a standalone film rather than trying to shoehorn a larger story and all its baggage into one film. The hope was, naturally, that there would be more films to explore further stories, but don't give in to the franchise temptation when you may only get one film out there. Especially, and they were self-aware enough to remember it, an R-rated movie has a steeper mountain to climb to get a sequel. Keep in mind that Deadpool hadn't come out yet, and the idea of a series of R-rated comic book movies didn't seem very likely. It was more a case of, okay, if this succeeds, film 2 would be his origin, film 3 would be the Dark Judges. But that's all it was, something in the back of the mind. The focus was on pouring everything into this film and deal with the happy surprise if they actually somehow had the chance to make more. The decision was thus made to have the film as an intersection between a cop storyline and two unique aspects of Judge Dredd's world. One was bringing in Cassandra Anderson, utilizing her mental abilities in the midst of what could otherwise be thought of as the law versus a criminal organization, give the story a special twist. The fact she was being evaluated also would allow for the natural conveying of information to the audience. What's more, while Dredd's minuscule change wasn't what you could really call a character arc, Anderson had room to stretch and grow. While he was at the center of the film, Anderson provided an anchor point for the audience's emotions. The other unique aspect of the Judge Dredd world was to set the story inside a mega-block. Its micro-city-state nature gave it an environment that had the tower confinement of Die Hard, yet also the gritty slum of a burned-out urban core. This particular mega-block, Peachtrees, was so named because Garland first met Wagner in a restaurant called the Peachtree. Wagner overall found the compromises for the film reasonable. The costumes, for example, had some changes more towards realistic body armor, especially including the reduction of the shoulder eagle to an emblem of an eagle instead. It was found it just wasn't possible to do actual action things with that there. It was an encumbrance, plus a potential hazard during sequences with stuntmen. The helmet, that unremovable helmet, was made to match the comic as much as possible, serving as a bridge between Dredd's toned-down body armor for the film and his comic book costume. And wearing that helmet would be Karl Urban. Urban's attraction to and involvement in films in or adjacent to geek properties is well known, such as working hard to get the role of Bones for the 2009 Star Trek film. And he was indeed interested in hearing more about a potential Judge Dredd film, but he didn't jump the gun. He knew about the character from his own youth's interest in the comic books, but the Stallone film showed that filmmakers might not get what gave Dredd his appeal, that he was a character who walked the edge of a blade between holding back the law of the jungle of Mega City 1 and the risk of being seen as a fascist. What perhaps best illustrated the complexity was Dredd's interaction with a homeless junkie at the entrance to Peachtree's, prioritizing responding to the murders over arresting the vagrant. He's let off with a warning to leave. But then Judge Dredd is fully prepared to arrest him on the way out when he hasn't budged from his spot. The audience sees Dredd's adherence to the law even to the point of oppression, but that is also softened by the fact that the junkie had been given a fair chance to avoid this if he'd only bothered. Likewise, contrasting him with other judges who have been bought and sold paints Judge Dredd as a man of principles who believes in what they're doing. The audience sees their crimes and gets the distinction. These are people who think themselves above the law. Judge Dredd is the law. Satisfied that the script got it, Urban then pursued the chance to bring the title character to life, and his knowledge of the character from moment one of the audition helped cement it. To operate fully with the helmet on required tapping into his theater experience, having to act with the whole of the body and not just the face, as often happened in film or television. Olivia Thirby's Anderson served as a contrast then, as the character appears sans helmet in the source material, justified by it interfering with her abilities. She found the role attractive, saying that while this was an action film, it was about people and character. That made it a cut above other roles in her view. The two performers would meet before the shoot on a daily basis to help work out their dynamic. Unlike other action films, Dredd was the rare case where the male and female leads had no relationship, nor even sexual tension. They are two professionals doing a professional's job, and they wanted to capture that form of chemistry. Playing the villain, Mama, would be Lena Headey. Headey's two big speculative fiction roles as the title character of the Sarah Connor Chronicles and the cruel Cersei Lannister of Game of Thrones make her a recognizable, versatile performer. She finds herself attracted to playing characters who are in some way broken, and in Mama, she found someone who was dead but still walking. She likened the character in some ways to an old great white shark, perhaps longing for the end yet not going to it meekly. She also felt that Mama would find the confrontation with Dredd particularly enticing. Even though he was an enemy, he might finally be someone that could make her feel something. This insight blew everyone away, as she knew how to take scenes that another performer would likely have filled with rage and instead did it with menace and subtext, achieving in a quiet voice more than what someone else might do with screaming. Garland had the idea for the drug of the film, slow-mo, to see if there was a way that violence shot the way high-speed filming of nature documentaries were could be beautiful. This actually played well with the ultimate decision on how to shoot the film, which was in the heyday of the post-Avatar 3D film trend. There were two ways to achieve this. One was using special 3D cameras, and the other was having the 3D generated after shooting. It goes without saying that the former produces better results than the latter. It is said the latter likely contributed to the decline of 3D. As a film scholar noted, it died of septic shock, poisoned by its own crap. For Dredd, the decision was made that if they were going to do 3D, they would go all in on it, and boasted of it on their posters. It's for this reason that many believed, and even still do believe, the title of the film is Dredd 3D, because of the prominent placement of the 3D tag. To film it, Andrew McDonald spoke to his brother Kevin, himself a filmmaker and the director of the aforementioned The Last King of Scotland. Kevin McDonald had just shot the Roman period piece The Eagle, which was filmed by Anthony Dodd Mantle, and it was agreed that Mantle would be an ideal choice for such a challenge. The award-winning cinematographer rose to that challenge, even building a special rig to get some great shots that could perfectly capture both the 3D and the high speed. He found the whole thing an intriguing premise. Quote, The story places itself precariously on the floorboards of an action sci-fi genre film, whilst underneath there's a no less entertaining allegorical comment about this kind of cinema and the violence that tends to come with this kind of product. His approach helped Dredd stand out from the crowd, getting it praised as a film that bucked the raw adrenaline of action films with meticulous calculation instead. The most controversial question of Dredd is the directing. Technically, it was Pete Travis, who aside of Vantage Point had only directed television before now. However, it seemed on set that there were problems, with conflicting stories of what exactly happened. Piecing together the various accounts, it sounds like Travis didn't quite get the character of the film, to the point that Urban refused to take direction from him. Garland himself, who would go on to direct many works, was involved in directing in some ways, though the degree of that is also in question. The Directors Guild of Great Britain felt that Garland's presence was not enough to merit a co-director credit. Garland, on the other hand, felt that he devoted so much to it, needed to sink into so much of the tedious of it and not get any credit for it, that it soured him on the idea of doing another Dredd project, even if it were to come up. The film was completed for its 2012 release, and while the Stallone film bombed with a 22% Rotten Tomatoes rating, this film scored with the critics, 80%. Despite that, Dredd suffered from 3 blows against it. First, the coincidental release of an Indonesian action film, The Raid: Redemption, which was similarly a gritty action picture involving an army of criminals in an apartment building, drawing many unfair assertions that Dredd was plagiarized. Second, there was 3D fatigue, coupled with a distributor that released too few 2D versions of the film to get the more lucrative 3D ticket sales, but all that resulted in was fewer people seeing the film at all. The third and most devastating was the utter failure to successfully market the film. Dredd soared on DVD right out of the gate, showing there was demand for it. It was just that people hadn't known it existed. But as a consequence, the film fit with Garland's initial expectations that it wouldn't be the start of a series, but rather a standalone work. Yet even as a standalone work, the film is a success, and what's more, the wish from those who saw it too late lamenting that fact. Dredd may have done poorly at the box office, but it fulfilled one criteria that a true hit should have. It left the audience both satisfied, but also calling for more.